She opened the emergency door, but instead of escaping, she ran back into the gunfire. Why would a 22-year-old flight attendant choose to die when she had the chance to live? September 5th, 1986, Pan Am. Flight 73 was about to depart Karachi, bound for New York. But within minutes, 4 men stormed the plane. What followed was a 17-hour siege, a massacre, and a sacrifice the world would never forget. September 5th, 1986. The sun rose slowly over Karachi, its first rays glinting off the metal hulls of aircraft parked along the runway at Jinnah International Airport. On the surface, it was a day like any other. Flight crews filed into terminals. Children clung to their mothers' hands. Ground staff moved in practiced patterns, guiding luggage carts across the tarmac, checking manifests, watching the clocks. Parked near Gate 47 was a Boeing 747, registered as Clipper Empress of the Seas. Its call sign, Pan Am Flight 73. The aircraft had arrived from Bombay, a scheduled stop on its journey to Frankfurt, and then on to New York City. It was a long-haul flight, one of the most important in Pan-American World Airways network, connecting the East to the West. On board were 367 people, passengers and crew, drawn from over a dozen different countries. Indians, Pakistanis, Germans, Americans, and more. Families, tourists, diplomats, infants in arms, some traveling home, others chasing new beginnings. The flight crew moved through their routines with quiet professionalism. In the forward galley, flight attendants double-checked meal orders and seat assignments. In the cockpit, 3 American pilots ran through their pre-flight checklist. Captain Bill Kianka, First Officer Conway Dodge, and Flight Engineer John Ridgway, all veterans of military aviation, now working in civilian skies. And among the cabin crew was a young woman, just 22, on her first flight as lead purser. Her name was Nirja Panat. She had trained for this. Months of drills, procedures, and exams. But nothing that day seemed unusual. Nothing signaled that it would be her final flight. Boarding began as scheduled. Batches of passengers filed into the cabin, greeted by smiles and gestures toward their assigned rows. There were minor delays. Someone had lost their boarding pass. A child refused to sit, but nothing out of the ordinary. The boarding music played softly, interrupted occasionally by the overhead chime. To those outside the aircraft, it was simply another plane waiting to push back. To those already on board, it was the beginning of a transcontinental journey, a long flight ahead, perhaps a little sleep, maybe a movie. No one, not one person on that aircraft, imagined they would be spending the next 17 hours inside a prison of metal and fear. And yet, just minutes after the last passenger stepped through the door, everything began to shift. A vehicle pulled up to the tarmac, a small airport van bearing an emergency beacon on its roof. Inside were 4 men in sky-blue uniforms, mimicking the color and cut of local airport security. They moved with purpose, flashing forged credentials, claiming to be escorting a Libyan diplomat. The guards at the gate hesitated for only a moment. Then the vehicle was waved through. What happened next would fracture the illusion of safety, not just in Karachi, but across the world. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. The van came to a slow stop near the aircraft. For a moment, everything remained still. One of the hijackers adjusted the brim of his cap, glancing toward the open door of the plane. Another checked the strap of his rifle beneath the folds of his jacket. None of the ground crew suspected anything unusual. Their uniforms looked official. Their documents had been accepted. The men moved with the calm confidence of those who belonged exactly where they stood. Without warning, the calm dissolved. 3 of the men leapt from the van. Their weapons were drawn before their feet hit the ground. The sharp, metallic click of safeties being released echoed in the still morning air. A security guard turned instinctively toward the sound, but he didn't have time to react. A single shot rang out, then another. In less than 10 seconds, 2 airport staff were down. The air around the boarding stairs turned hot with panic. Inside the aircraft, the crew heard the commotion. Through the narrow galley windows, someone caught sight of the armed men running toward the door. Nirja was at the front of the cabin when she heard the first shots. She froze for a breath, then turned to the nearest intercom and sent the coded alert: hijack in progress. In the cockpit, the 3 pilots received the signal, their instincts sharpened by military training. Without hesitation, they followed protocol for a hijack without direct confrontation. One by one, they climbed through the overhead hatch above the cockpit, pushing into the narrow escape tunnel. From there, they dropped to the tarmac and ran. The cockpit was now empty. By the time the hijackers entered the aircraft, they were met with no resistance from the flight crew. They swept down the aisle with cold efficiency, weapons raised, voices sharp. They spoke in Arabic, their commands directed at the passengers, but their tone made the meaning clear. Hands up. Stay seated. Do not move. The forward doors were sealed. Lights dimmed. The jet bridge was pulled away. The aircraft, still parked on the ground, had become a fortress, a prison sealed in steel and silence. In the rear galley, passengers began to cry. A child whimpered, then was hushed by a mother too afraid to speak. One of the hijackers marched down the aisle, stopping at random to bark orders, to search bags, to scan faces. He pointed his rifle at a teenage boy who looked American. The boy flinched. Then he passed. Nirja moved carefully through the cabin, her face calm, her voice low. She told the passengers to remain still. She told them help would come. But in her eyes, there was no false comfort, only focus. She knew the cockpit was empty. She knew that without pilots, the aircraft couldn't be flown, couldn't be redirected to Cyprus or Libya or anywhere else the attackers might have planned. She also knew this fact would not calm them. It would enrage them. For now, they didn't seem to realize the pilots were gone. That would change. And when it did, everything inside this plane would shift again. She looked toward the cabin doors, toward the narrow aisles and dimming lights, and quietly began to prepare. What began as a flight to New York had become something else entirely. It was no longer a journey. It was a siege. Time inside the aircraft began to stretch. The minutes no longer moved in order. They pulsed, shifted, folded in on themselves. For the people on board Pan Am Flight 73, time became a shadow, a weight, something that lingered over every breath and silenced even the smallest sound. After the initial takeover, the hijackers moved with intensity, but not chaos. Their weapons remained raised, their eyes scanning constantly. They were trained for this, not as soldiers, but as men who had memorized the instructions for fear. They spoke little, except to shout commands. Most of the passengers didn't understand the language, but the tone was universal. Do not speak, do not move, obey. With the cockpit now empty, the attackers grew restless. At first, they didn't notice, but soon, as hours passed without any sign of the pilots, the truth became clear. The men they needed were gone. The ones who could fly the aircraft, who could take them to Cyprus or Beirut or wherever their orders dictated, had vanished. That discovery changed the mood inside the plane. The first demand was for a radio operator, someone who could communicate with the tower. When no one stepped forward, the threats began. Passengers were forced to the front. A man in his 20s, Rajesh Kumar, was pushed to his knees. He held both an American passport and an Indian identity. They accused him of lying, of working for the Americans. He pleaded, quietly at first, then louder as panic took hold. A shot cracked through the cabin. He slumped forward and his body fell against the door. The plane went still. From that moment on, the air inside changed. Every sound became sharper. Every movement felt dangerous. The passengers sat rigid in their seats, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to look the wrong way. Children curled against their parents. Strangers held hands. Others shut their eyes and waited. Nirja remained in motion. She moved down the aisles slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked on the faces of the people around her. She offered water. She checked on the elderly. She whispered in the ears of terrified passengers, "Don't panic. Stay down. Don't let them see your fear." Her calmness became its own language. It didn't promise survival, but it reminded everyone they were still alive. The hijackers ordered the crew to collect passports. They wanted Americans first. Nirja understood why. She had read enough, heard enough, trained for scenarios like this in theory. But now she was inside one. She quietly directed the other flight attendants to hide as many American passports as they could. In seat cushions, beneath trays, inside food compartments. Anything that would buy time. 41 were hidden. 6 were missed. The next hours passed in silence, broken only by sudden commands, random searches, or the occasional burst of shouting between the hijackers themselves. It was clear they were improvising now. Their plan had relied on forward motion, on reaching the sky. Without it, their strategy collapsed into uncertainty. The air grew warmer. The lights flickered. Somewhere near the rear galley, a baby began to cry. The mother whispered against the child's ear, gently, rhythmically, until the sound faded again into silence. Nirja knelt in the aisle beside a group of unaccompanied minors. They were no older than 6 or 7. She handed each of them a small carton of juice and asked if they were tired. They nodded. She smiled, though her hands were trembling. She didn't tell them what she was planning. She only told them they were doing well, and that when the moment came, they would need to move quickly. Still, the moment had not come, and outside no one seemed closer to a solution. The tower was negotiating, slowly, carefully, offering promises, asking questions. But the hijackers grew impatient. Their eyes darted toward the windows. The sun had begun to set. The shadows inside the aircraft deepened. The auxiliary power, slowly draining since the takeover, would not last much longer. The passengers had now been held for nearly 15 hours. They didn't yet know it, but soon the darkness would fall completely. And when it did, it would bring with it something far more terrifying than silence. Night descended with quiet indifference. Outside, the runway lights flickered across the concrete, bathing the tarmac in faint amber. Inside the aircraft, the last of the emergency lighting began to dim. The air, already heavy with exhaustion and fear, grew denser. Every breath felt slower, shallower, as if the cabin itself were shrinking inward. After nearly 17 hours, the tension had settled into something more dangerous than panic. It had become fatigue, the kind that blurs the line between hope and surrender. Passengers no longer whispered. Most sat in stillness, eyes fixed on the floor, or closed tight in quiet prayer. The silence was no longer a choice. It was survival. Any sound might draw attention, and attention could mean violence. The hijackers moved less now. Their movements were sharper, more erratic. Their voices rose not in command, but in conflict. Arguments in a language most on board couldn't understand. But tone needs no translation. They were unraveling. And when control begins to slip from the hands of men with weapons, what follows is almost always chaos. Just before 9 o'clock, the last of the auxiliary power failed. The plane dropped into near total darkness. Only the faint red glow of a few emergency indicators remained. The temperature inside began to fall, and for the first time since morning, the hijackers shouted not at the passengers, but into the void, into radios that no longer worked, into the blackness outside. One of them began pacing the aisle. Another loaded his rifle again. The lead hijacker stepped forward and barked a single order. There was no answer. His eyes scanned the cabin. Then, slowly, his hand moved to the strap of a grenade. In the dim light, Nirja saw him. She didn't hesitate. She rose from her crouch and turned toward the rear door. Her hands moved swiftly, reaching for the lever, knowing what she had to do. There was no time to wait, no time to think. She pulled. The door unlocked with a metallic clunk, releasing a hiss of cold night air into the cabin. Behind her, passengers stirred. Some gasped. A few cried out, but most understood instantly. The door was open. It was time to run. One by one, in the confusion and dark, people surged toward the opening. They leapt from the height, 5 meters above the ground, some landing hard, others rolling. A few fell awkwardly and screamed in pain, but they were out. They were off the plane. At the other end of the aircraft, another door opened, and another. A slide deployed, only one, and began carrying passengers down to the tarmac in a rush of panic and desperate movement. The hijackers, blinded by the dark and overtaken by rage, opened fire. Gunfire tore through the cabin. Nirja didn't move toward the exit. She turned back, toward the rows of seats, searching for the 3 children she had spoken to earlier. She found them curled beneath row 32, clinging to one another. Without a word, she bent down, gathered them into her arms, and pushed them forward. As they reached the door, she shielded them with her body. The bullets found her. One struck her shoulder. Another tore through her spine. She didn't cry out. She didn't stop moving. With the last of her strength, she pushed the final child down the slide, then collapsed beside the exit, her body lying across the threshold she had opened. She was still breathing when 2 other flight attendants reached her, dragged her onto the slide, and followed the others down into the chaos of the runway. Minutes later, Pakistani commandos stormed the aircraft. The gunfire stopped. The hijackers were subdued, but the damage had already been done. Inside the cabin, the light remained off. Smoke drifted through the aisles. The silence, this time, was final. The runway was scattered with shoes. A child's sweater, torn and trampled. Blood smears stretched across the concrete like brushstrokes left by a shaking hand. The silence that followed the gunfire was not peace. It was the kind of silence that arrives only after everything has been taken. Rescue workers moved among the injured, their voices hushed, even in urgency. Flashlights scanned faces, searched for movement. In the flickering light, the survivors looked not like passengers, but like ghosts, shells of themselves, pulled from metal and smoke. Some sat with their heads in their hands. Others lay where they had landed, eyes wide, blinking, waiting for someone to tell them it was over. Nirja Panot was found near the rear slide, barely conscious. Her uniform was soaked through. The bullets had torn through her left side, fracturing ribs, collapsing part of a lung. She had lost too much blood. Still, she was alive when they carried her to the ambulance. Her pulse was weak, but it was there. She died before sunrise. 21 people had been killed. More than 100 were injured. The rest survived, but few ever truly returned to the lives they had before that day. Some carried scars, stitched across their arms, their backs, their necks. Others bore wounds that didn't bleed, wounds that surfaced only in sleep, in the sound of a door slamming, in the echo of children crying on a plane. The 4 hijackers were captured, all of them alive, their weapons discarded on the floor of the cabin. They were taken into Pakistani custody, interrogated, tried. In 1988, a court sentenced them to death. But in the years that followed, through appeals, political interference, and shifting alliances, those sentences were reduced. Some served time, others were released. One was later arrested again, caught trying to flee, turned over to the FBI, and imprisoned in the United States. But the damage done was not undone by prison bars or courtroom transcripts. In the days after the attack, Neerja's name began to appear in headlines, not just in India, but around the world. She was not described as a martyr or a hero. The words came later. At first, she was simply a name, a young woman who chose not to run, a voice in the dark, a shield for those who couldn't protect themselves. Her story grew slowly, told first by those she had saved. The man who remembered her voice telling him to crouch low. The mother who found her child alive because Neerja had passed her forward through the aisle. The flight attendant who saw her open the door and knew in that moment that survival had become possible. In Mumbai, her funeral drew thousands. A city paused to honor a daughter it had barely known. Her face, framed by soft curls, eyes calm, a half-smile beneath her Pan Am cap, became an image carried in wallets, folded into prayer books, taped to walls. Not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had chosen. Later, awards were given, the Ashoka Chakra, India's highest civilian honor for bravery in peacetime. Commendations from Pan Am, from international agencies, from governments. Schools and scholarships were named for her. A foundation was established in her memory, dedicated to women facing violence and discrimination. Her family spoke not of what had been taken from them, but of what had been left behind. But no recognition could ever equal the quiet weight of what she had done. She had no weapon, no armor, no command. And yet, in the narrow body of an airplane, on a morning that began like any other, she became something few ever do. She became the reason others lived. And in the end, for those who survived, the memory of that moment, the door opening, the rush of air, the sound of her voice, was what remained. Not the bullets, not the blood, but the choice.